Catholic chemistry. So, if you are a Catholic and you are single and you don't want to be single, what do?
You become a priest. Welcome to Crusader Pub. This is my first debate review, and I will be reviewing Trent Horn against Matt Dillahunty, arguing over the reasonableness of the resurrection. With Trent Horn taking the affirmative, he, of course, went first. And he didn't spend a whole lot of time arguing about the pieces of evidence that are usually presented, like the empty tomb, the personal changes in the disciples, the fact that he was witnessed resurrected by many people afterwards. He pretty much skipped over that and went over the fact that most historians accept these facts as being facts, being true. And with that, it is reasonable to believe that these events occurred, and that therefore it's reasonable to believe in the resurrection. He spends more time talking about the reasonableness of the resurrection and spends less time on the arguments themselves, which I understand, because that was really the focus of the debate. There have been many debates on the resurrection. He took a little bit of a different angle on it, which I appreciated. He did spend some time arguing for the existence of a God, and which would make the resurrection a viable thing if God exists. I think he could have used that time a little bit differently in order to actually address the arguments for the resurrection itself, though. Then again, Trent Horn is Trent Horn, and I'm here doing this in my bedroom with my kids' art hanging over my shoulder. That said, this quick summary of what Trent said should show you exactly what I mean.
However, the resurrection is different because we have reasons to believe God was involved based on the nature of the disciples' testimony. That means if you're a non-Christian who believe God exists, which is half of religiously unaffiliated Americans, you could consider the resurrection within your own current worldview. What if you don't believe God exists, and so it seems like there's nothing to cause Jesus to rise from the dead? Well, the resurrection could make you rethink that idea. But I might also argue an argument for the existence of God. This one's called the argument from change. I like it. It goes like this. Change occurs when a potential X becomes an actual Y. We see change all the time. It can be like growth or movement, but no potential X can become an actual Y on its own any more than water can freeze itself or a train car can propel itself.
In this next clip, you will see Trent Horn shift the burden of proof onto Dillahunty just a little bit, and I'm actually going to disagree with Horn on this point, because taking the negative position, all Dillahunty really has to do is show why Trent Horn's argument does not make the resurrection a reasonable thing to believe in. He doesn't have to provide extra evidence as to why the resurrection is unreasonable. He's taking the negative position on that.
Finally, as the debate continues, don't forget about Matt's burden of proof. He has to show it's unreasonable to believe Jesus rose from the dead. So keep asking this question as you hear his opening statement. Matt says belief in the resurrection is unreasonable because fill in the blank.
Trent wraps up his opening statement. He does do a pretty slick presuppositional move here. He attacks the foundation that Dillahunty is coming from, his epistemological positioning. And he's going to define what that means and show how it is its own presupposition that he needs to rely on to reject the argument for the resurrection. And that is again a really solid move of Trent Horn. But then he does go back to saying, well, he needs to provide a reason that the resurrection is unreasonable. And again, he doesn't have to actually do that. He just has to show why Trent Horn's position doesn't work.
So as the debate continues, I think you'll see that his reasons that fill in the blank are flawed because they either lead us to one, rejecting many facts of history we already know to be reasonable, and two, they make arbitrary judgments about reality based on Matt's assumptions about the world instead of keeping an open mind about how the world works. So instead of that particular epistemology or way of not, that term will show up a lot, epistemology. That just means the study of knowing. Like, how do we know about the world? How do we figure out what's really going on? Okay. So I have a way of figuring out what's going on when it comes to unusual events. I gave a 3-pronged test for it. And I hope Matt proposes a way of figuring out how to discern unusual events and claims of unusual events. And as I said, he'll try to show that this unusual event, the resurrection, is unreasonable because fill in the blank. Why does he think it's unreasonable? And then you'll see those reasons either lead to rejecting other reasonable beliefs or they end up being arbitrary. Instead, I would argue that you should accept the standard that I've offered and then seriously consider the truth and meaning behind Jesus Christ having risen from the dead and consequently demonstrating the truth of the Christian faith.
So with Matt's opening statement, he says something that I really liked and I really agreed with, and I think it set a really good tone for what he would say next. Just because something is reasonable doesn't mean that it is true, and just because something seems unreasonable doesn't mean it is false. I'll let you hear it for yourself here.
So how do we go about telling if it's reasonable to believe a claim? And then it's worth noting this is separate from whether or not the claim is in fact true. The claim could be false, and yet you could still have a reasonable belief in it. For once upon a time, it was reasonable to believe that the sun went around the earth because that's what we saw when we looked up in the sky.
Here comes Dillahunty's big point of attack. And his big point of attack is to attack history itself.
We can't argue that it's rational to believe something that we can't test at all. And so we do the best we can when it comes to history. And so when we take a look at history, all we have are reports. Somebody said they saw this, somebody said they knew this person, somebody said this other thing. That's all well and good when we're trying to put together the best understanding of history we can. But we shouldn't be proclaiming it as truth, and we shouldn't necessarily be saying that this particular version of history is particularly reasonable, because history tends to be written by the victors. And so history is always suspect.
He's going to go on to dismiss the idea of history in general a few more times throughout the debate. If I can find the right clips, I will put them up. But the big point is, if he can avoid giving any real serious weight to history, he can avoid the arguments for the resurrection altogether. Doesn't matter what the disciples experienced, doesn't matter what they saw, doesn't matter what they reported. History's suspect, so it's reasonable for him to reject anything from history, and therefore he can reject the resurrection. Now, for some reason, he spends a lot of time talking about figs.
It would be really remarkable to say Jesus ate figs for our salvation. We know that figs exist. We know that dogs exist. We know that figs exist and are eaten. So it's not extraordinary to claim that Jesus ate a fig unless Jesus didn't exist or figs weren't around at that time. Jesus cursing a fig tree for not producing figs when it wasn't in season, which I would argue isn't something that a divine entity knowledgeable about figs and fruit seasons would do. And it seems bizarre to curse a fig tree.
Yeah, that was weird. Dillahunty's argument is ultimately that because something doesn't agree with his current understanding of science, it must not be true, or it can't be true, or at least it's unreasonable to believe that that is true. Of course, relying on the scientific method itself is unreasonable by that standard because you can't test the scientific method. You can say, well, by using the scientific method, it works out for us, therefore it must be true. However, if you look into physics at all, on a cosmic scale, you can read A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. You can watch documentaries that feature people like Lawrence Krauss, firm atheists who acknowledge the problems with trying to take Newtonian physics and general relativity and combine them. It just doesn't, you can't do it. It doesn't work. So there's the famous theory of everything. It's the idea of combining those two theories together. And I'm not a physicist, and that is not at all where I'm going to go with anything that I'm arguing ever. But just a quick reading of even the pop culture discussions, it shows us how difficult that is. So even basic science has to be taken on faith to some degree.
No, like I gave an example in my opening statement. Like, at least from what I saw with your engagement with Alex O'Connor, you do not
Oh my
believe a
God.
person. What's wrong?
What the hell does Alex O'Connor have to do with this? You've mentioned him twice. He's an atheist. Well, the discussion wasn't about. Okay.
What I'm trying to find is that there is a belief you're not convinced of, but you wouldn't say is unreasonable. Do you think ethical veganism that Alex endorses is unreasonable?
Yes. And I was getting ready to get to that in my response.
What you saw there, that was from the cross-examination. It was Trent's turn to ask questions, and it seemed to be going okay overall, even though Dillahunty especially, and I'm not trying to just bash the guy because I disagree with him for being an atheist. He genuinely didn't seem to really care about the format so much. He kind of just did his own thing. But that whole thing aside, there's a classic example of what he likes to do is when the question doesn't really go his way or he doesn't like it, he kind of explodes at the person who's asking it, as if that's going to help his case or as if that's relevant to what he's talking about. It's Trent's turn to ask questions and his turn to answer the questions, not to interrupt Trent Horn while he's asking them, not to put in his own commentary. And him getting angry like that for no reason, it just kind of shows low-class debating, in my opinion, especially since he says he was going to get to that in his rebuttal. So Trent Horn is bringing up something valid, something that was going to come up later anyway. So there was really no reason for him to go off like that. I'm going to show you he does the exact same thing in his own cross-examination time. He's going to go after Trent, and he's going to use his time to pontificate, essentially. And then he suggests, well, that's my time. No, it's not his time. It's his time to ask questions, and Trent answers. He can't talk. He can't comment. He asks questions. That's it.
The physical understanding of the universe was suspended for an individual based only on testimonial accounts. It is unreasonable. That is how you get conned. That is how magicians fool you. No, I didn't, but it's my time, isn't it?
Now Trent is going to say, well, that's just how debates get. Don't worry about him getting fired up. This is normal stuff in a heated debate, and it's okay. We can still be buddies. And I understand he's a nice guy. I understand what he's doing there. But seriously, Trent, you can't let someone run over you like that in a debate. You have to stick to the format and make sure they stick to that. Don't let them pontificate. Don't let them tell you how to answer questions, which he did just before this clip started. Don't let him do any of that. You make sure the time is used to your advantage as the format dictates. And he completely took advantage of the entire situation. And yeah, you shouldn't have let that happen, even if you are a gentleman. Now, the debate overall was pretty predictable. Trent's arguments were predictable. Dillahunty's objections were predictable. Cross-examination was exactly what you expect. They had a discussion afterwards that was interesting. I don't think it's really worth going over too much, except that at one point Dillahunty did compare it to Elvis sightings, Jesus sightings, Elvis sightings, and that was probably the most interesting part of the discussion, but you probably know exactly where that went. And the closing statements were pretty unremarkable. So, yeah, I don't think anyone's mind is changed by this debate. Matt Dillahunty fans are just going to support Matt Dillahunty almost no matter what he says. And pretty much the same thing is true for Trent Horn fans, the ones who are theists and already believe in the resurrection. Really the only people he could probably get are theists who aren't Christians. But again, with the way Matt debates and the format of the debate and the fact that it was a Christian versus an atheist, that probably is going to have too big of an impact there. It is a cool thing to listen to these guys talk, though. They're both very intelligent men. So I do recommend watching the whole 2+ hours on that debate. I just knocked my lamp a little bit. It's definitely worth your time. That said, there's one last thing that I want to address that Trent Horn said that I absolutely disagree with.
And Matt, just for common ground, I also am irked by Christians who deny basic aspects of science. I am very irked at those who deny the efficacy of vaccines, the fact the universe is billions of years old. So for find common ground with you, I share your frustration. I want to be reasonable in my beliefs. And frankly, there are Catholics even who believe things about the Catholic faith that I don't share because I believe they're being unreasonable.
And this just seems to be a case of him trying to find common ground with Dillahunty to have a smoother conversation. Now, I believe that Trent does believe in vaccines and is probably frustrated with the Christians who are opposed to vaccines, and I'm sure he does believe the universe is 1 billion years old, but he worded those things in a bit of an aggressive way, especially since a few moments before they were talking about vaccines in context of COVID-19, and it is perfectly reasonable to be hesitant about those vaccines, no matter how pro-vaccine you are. It is untested. We are the test subjects as we get the vaccines, those of us who do. And normally vaccines get 10 years of testing before they're made publicly available. And this is a few months. And that's scary. And we're already seeing negative side effects to those vaccines, people dying over some of them. And even though they're pulling them out of the market, the fact that they're not getting properly tested, they're not going through the normal channels to get this done, on a whole new style of vaccine, something we've never done before, that is scary. And it's reasonable to hesitate and even be opposed to this until it's been tested thoroughly. As far as the age of the universe goes, that is not a hill that I'm willing to die on. And I know good, faithful Christians who are also very intelligent people with high education who believe in a young earth. And that's okay. And it shouldn't drive Trent Horn crazy that there's Christians who believe that. What can get to me is if they try to make a huge dogma out of that when neither scripture nor tradition allows for that. But you take a guy like Robert Sungenis, and he's a smart guy. I enjoy listening to him. He's a little dry, which I feel like I've been this evening, considering this. I haven't practiced this. This is a new thing for me. But he's a guy worth listening to. And he believes in a 6,000-year-old universe. And even in the debate, Trent spent time talking about how you can't trust the uniformity of nature, the apparent uniformity of nature. Well, if it works there, it certainly works in arguing for a young Earth. The non-uniformity of the speed of light, scientists can already say that the speed of light is not constant. We thought for a long time that it was. It's not. It's not a constant. It can change. My point isn't to argue for a young Earth or against a young Earth. My point is that I disagree with Trent Horn's approach there. He didn't have to alienate part of his audience over trying to make a better connection with Dillahunty. That's a conversation for another time, and something hopefully in-house. I'd also like to know what his other thoughts were, other Catholic beliefs. I imagine he's going for either very liberal or very conservative traditionalist Catholics. But again, in the context of a debate on the resurrection, I wouldn't have even brought it up, to be honest. But if you've stuck around and watched so far, thank you so much for watching. I will hopefully get better at these, and hopefully we can grow together. Right now, my audience is my mom, so hopefully I can add you soon.